things to do. I've been to all 3 of the US bases. I'm the only doctor that has actually done a full season at all the bases. You gotta start quantifying things. It used to be, say, I'm the only doctor that's been in all the bases. Not true anymore. Scientist assistant occasionally. But this is Lee, and Lee is a real scientist.
Well, I worked as a research technician at Palmer Station for the past 3 years for a couple of different labs as a part of something called the Long-Term Ecological Research Project. So it's been running for about 20 years at Palmer Station, collecting data about the marine food web, so starting with the bacteria, then there's a lab studying plankton and seabirds and whales, and kind of looking at how the whole system is responding to climate change. Lab, and when I go back in October, I'll be working with Anne with the seabird lab.
Because what happens is, if you're good, they promote you to bigger and more interesting animals.
Yeah. If you're annoying enough, if you bug enough PIs, then they let you go.
So what I'm going to do is just start out in the order of the stations I went to. So the first station I went to was McMurdo Station, and then we'll talk about South Pole, which I was at actually 3rd, and then we'll skip back to Palmer Station, where I've spent 2 summers when Lee was there. So, having fun. So this is a bunch of people that are out there spelling out Antarctica. And Lee is the T in Antarctica. So one of those things you wonder about is, why the heck is the US down in Antarctica? It is incredibly expensive to be in Antarctica. So for example, at the South Pole, the calculated cost of a gallon of aviation fuel, about $30 a gallon, and they burn through a ton of it. Now, in part, and we'll talk about that, you got to get it down there somehow. So you fly it down on a plane and you burn up a full 1/3 of what you're taking, getting it down there. Or you take it on big diesel, like Caterpillar tractors, and pull it 800 miles across snow and glaciers, watching for crevasses, and get it to the South Pole. So getting things there is hard. So the question is, what the heck are we doing there? So you do research for fundamental knowledge on the Antarctic continent itself. What's going on there? You know, is the ice really receding? What's between the species? So you're looking at changes in ice mass, changes in ice movement. You're also looking at the biology of the unique flora and fauna of Antarctica, and we'll have lots of pictures of animals, because that's the fun part. And research on Antarctica's role in global systems, and we'll see that in a second. For example, neutrino detection and evaluation. You can pretty much only do that in Antarctica, and the why of that is interesting, and we'll see that. Seismic event detection. There is a detector at Palmer Stations around the world. It also looks for events that shook the Earth that aren't earthquakes. So it's a nuclear test monitoring station. And why the heck is it in Palmer Station? Because it's one of the most seismically stable places in the world. And so it's a place when you detect a quake, you can see it from a long way away. So for example, when there was the nice earthquake here back in, was it February or March or something? We saw it down at Palmer when it happened. And as a platform for other research. So NASA does a lot of research in the dry valleys when they have been looking at vehicles for the Martian environment. They test them out in the dry valleys because it's dry, it's cold, the soils are similar. So they've got a model for that Martian environment. Okay. So one of the things people always ask is, are there a lot of different stations down in Antarctica? Who's down there? So what happened is initially there were 7 different, so it's really wedges. There's a British section and a New Zealand section and an Australian section and a Chilean section and an Argentinian section. And everybody was thinking about exploiting Antarctica. But in 1959, right after or during the International Geophysical Year, 12 nations signed a treaty to set Antarctica aside for research and preservation for an undetermined period, but that treaty is still in effect. Since then, there have been a lot more signatories, and there are 75 research stations in Antarctica, 45 open year-round. So why are people there? Well, there's a saying that gets passed around a lot that says, you go there the first time for the adventure. You come back because the money's pretty good. And then the third time you come back because you just don't fit in anyplace else anymore. So it is really, Lee can correct me if she feels different, or you end up in Deadwood or one of those places because you've just been wandering so long, it's the end of the road. But oh, what a glorious end to that road. All right, so there's a map of where the stations are, and you can see the banana belt. The nicest, most beautiful areas in Antarctica, the warmest areas in Antarctica are out there on the Antarctic Peninsula. And this is an enlargement of the peninsula. And there are a ton of research stations out there because everybody wants to go there. Strangely enough, when you get to, and the most remote is Vostok Station, which is the Russian station, which is also the station that has recorded the coldest temperature ever recorded. I will speak in Fahrenheit because I learned that language. 122 below, pretty chilly.
Wow.
So there is U.S. McMurdo Station, and McMurdo is located right next, 3 kilometers away from the New Zealand station. There is our station, Palmer Station, out on the Antarctic Peninsula on Envers Island. And one of the jokes is that McMurdo's on Ross Island, Palmer Station is on Envers Island. And so most people who've been to Antarctica never touched foot on Antarctica because they ended up on an island someplace instead of on the continent. So if you want to go to the continent, you go to the South Pole. Okay. So to get there, if you're going to go to McMurdo, if you're going to go to the South Pole, you start out in Christchurch, New Zealand. And it's green, and it's beautiful, and it's lovely. And you go through the Antarctic Processing Center, and you fly to Antarctica. And if you get really lucky, it's a clear day, and you fly right over the top of Mount Erebus, which is located there on Ross Island, and is the southernmost active volcano in the world. And you're in your C-17 Globemaster most of the time, and you land on an ice runway. And you get out and you say, did I really mean to do this? But then you're there. And yes, they issue you the big red, the big white Mickey Mouse boots and all that stuff. It's called extreme cold weather gear. Obbs Hill. And you look down and you say, wow, that looks like a mining town. And it was put there by the Navy, and the Seabees went around and basically blew everything up that didn't look flat. And they're redesigning all the stations because they're all lower than hills. And they actually had the architect, that's the lead architect that's designing the stations, was there. And he talked to me for 10 minutes in glowing terms about Palmer Station and redesigning the buildings for Palmer Station because of the McMurdo, we might as well put in a bunch of mobile homes. So anyway, but that's McMurdo. Okay. When you're there, you always remember the legacies. So Scott's Hut from the 1901-1904 expedition is still there at McMurdo. You go into that hut and there's still supplies in the hut from the days of Scott's exposition. There's still a seal on the table that they were butchering, which froze in place, and it's still laying there. Canned goods from 1900. Now, an interesting thing happened when they were going through these. New Zealand was restoring the huts, and they went through and started to restore the hut that Shackleton had used. And they found some loose floorboards, and they opened up the loose floorboard, and there was scotch. And they took the bottles of scotch that were in these beautiful reed containers, and they took that scotch back to Scotland, and they used this wizardry technology where you put the sampler in and you find out exactly the makeup of the scotch. $8 a bottle. It tasted terrible. You think Shackleton's going to buy good scotch to feed to his troops? Oh no, he bought rock gut. So a bit about McMurdo. McMurdo's the largest of the U.S. Antarctic stations and the largest Antarctic station, period. Up to 1,200 people in the summer. It gets busy. Okay? In the winter, average of about 125 people. I wintered over there. It's got three primary purposes. There's primary research that happens there. Not a lot. Research field station, Waste Divide, and others where ice experiments happen, the dry valleys, and it serves as the center that supplies those stations. And it's also the support and resupply for the South Pole. You can't get directly to the South Pole, so anything going to the South Pole comes to McMurdo and from McMurdo to the pole. Okay. There is McMurdo General Hospital. It's not really a hospital, but it's a nice sign. So we've got a couple of clinic beds, a couple of sleepover beds if somebody gets really sick. And about 3 kilometers away is Scott Base, which is the New Zealand base. It has better food, better accommodations. Just if you say better, you pretty much got it right. So I get to Scott Base. It was the second night I'd been there. And I walk up to this lady and say, "Hi, I'm the doctor from over at McMurdo. What do you do?" She said, "I stand in the front of Zodiacs and I shoot orcas with a crossbow." And I said, "Okay." She collects little pieces of fat, looking at toxins, looking at hormones, looking at genetics, but has to stand up there and get them. And women have a huge role in Antarctica. Doesn't matter if you're a heavy equipment operator or whatever you are, women are pretty much well represented. So this is Shannon. She spent the winter and she was the heavy equipment operator. Okay. And what did I do? Most of the time I helped other people do other things because most of the time I'm kind of like a to do. But when it happens, oh, do you get busy. So this is somebody who got injured by a trailer, between a truck and a trailer that was backing up. And I took care of him for 5 or 6 days, and then we got him out on a medevac. But if you decide you have to medevac somebody from McMurdo and you can fly, the average cost to get that person out, $1 million. So I spent a lot of time doing other stuff. So this was a project looking at Weddell Seals, and they're trying to figure out how the Weddell Seals navigate in the absolute blackness under the ice with no landmarks, no other guidance. And the suspicion was that it's magnetic detection. And so they were taking the whales from an area that they had already looked at, they had already determined the patterns that whales used. And they moved them to an area which was a much older volcanic flow, and it had different geomagnetic lines in the iron-based rock. And they were looking to see if the seals oriented themselves differently. So we drilled artificial seal holes. Now, to set that up, of course, you have to set up roadways out there, and you do that while it's still winter. In this case, it's about 35 below with about a 40-mile-an-hour wind, and it was chilly, or at least I thought it was. So kind of the worst day was we have things called Cat 1, Cat 2, Cat 3. Cat 1 is the big storms, and this was a Cat 1. So that day, the high temperature was minus 25.1, low temperature was minus 32.6, and winds that day were about 70 miles an hour. We got 52 inches of snow. It was a zinger. On the upside of that, that's a picture of the bottom of my window in my barracks, and those are the frost crystals on the window. The beauty, if you're looking, is astonishing. So here is the last flight out. So McMurdo, last plane goes out someplace around March 5th or so. And then it was traditional that you never got another plane, one summer flight come in, someplace in mid-June. And all the old timers are like, "Oh, you don't know what it was like to have been here when you were isolated." You know, when you go from March to June without a banana, and then you go June to the end of August without a banana, yeah, I think you know what isolated is. But that's all of us standing there watching the last plane go away. So what do you do when you're not working? The answer is surprisingly a lot. So upper left corner was, we decided, we had a guy that was a theater producer. He decided he would get the scripts to some movies and we would have reads. So we are reading the script from The Big Lebowski in there. We had 3 bands on station, and you talk about excellent, excellent people. Jesse, the gentleman with the white-colored guitar there, that was the bass guitarist. He's a mechanic, but he's an amazing bass guitarist. And a lot of the people who are craftsmen also double as artists. So this is a famous piece of art there called the Seal. So that's one of my seals down there at the bottom. Midwinter Day. What do you do on Midwinter Day? You have the Midwinter Mile. I did a mile in 14 minutes and 6 seconds and felt pretty good about myself because I had micro spikes on, I had a headlamp on, it was 30 degrees below zero, and I felt good to finish the mile, thank you. There are 2 bars. In the summer, both bars get used. In the winter, really Gallagher's is where it's at. So if you want to go have a drink, you go to Gallagher's. But it gets to Midwinter Day, and you want to spice the place up. So this Midwinter Day is a true Antarctic holiday. It's June 21st, and you celebrate. You've had 3 months of blackness. You got 3 months of blackness to go. And so we decorated Gallagher's a little bit. Tin foil, blue lights, and ice crystals, and built an ice cave. Animals, not so much. So Weddell Seals, there are lots of Weddell Seals at the pressure ridges because there's lots of cracks in the ice at that with huge layers of fat. And you gotta have that to protect yourself against the severe cold. Interesting thing, does anybody know how Weddell Seals die? So they have to keep their breathing hole open all the time. And to do that, they chew at the ice edge of the breathing hole. And their life ends when they wear the teeth out to the point where they can't keep their breathing holes open anymore. Adelie penguins, we'll see more Adelie. Yeah.
Sounds about right.
We have a lot of them at Palmer. There weren't many at McMurdo, but they're still cute. And you think penguins and you think of them looking like that? Yeah, not always. Often they look like footballs. And one day emperor penguins came. And we were all like, whoa, emperor penguins. And it was about 30 below. And I walked out with my camera and I took my glove off and I was taking pictures and taking pictures and taking pictures. And then I realized I couldn't feel the button pull 30 times as fast as just having it out in the air. And I had frostbitten my index finger. And it never hurt a bit until it started to thaw. So, I took a picture, my friend took a picture, my friend submitted her picture to National Geographic, and it's the same picture, only hers was in National Geographic. That's mine. So you also get to be there at special times. So this is after twilight left, and we were up on the shoulders of Mount Erebus, and you can see the clouds are just amazing. But the best clouds are in the spring. They're called Nacreous Clouds, and they are just like the inside of an abalone shell, just iridescent, constantly changing, unbelievably beautiful. And sometimes you look out across the Transantarctic Mountains and you can't really believe that anything can be that beautiful. So, that's McMurdo. So if you're going to go to the South Pole, you hop off your C-17, you hop on a C-130 on skates, and you fly to the South Pole. There's some differences about the South Pole. A, it's cold. B, it's high, 9,300 feet. But because the atmosphere is thin over the poles, the effective altitude, depending on barometric pressure, is someplace between 10.6 and 12.4. And we got lots of people altitude medicine. And they were the most beautiful Smurf color you've ever seen. So there's the South Pole Station. And what's interesting is we get some tourists at the South Pole Station. One of the ones we got was an astronaut who had spent a year on the space station. And he walked through and said, you know, it's not that different. this is the tunnels under the base. So it's spooky down there, and people have made it even spookier because they go down and cut niches in the walls and then put the strangest stuff in the niches. So there's a frozen sturgeon that the Russians gave to us back in like 1982, and it's still down there. But why they need the tunnels? We have to have water, we have to have sewage. How do you get water? You run way out, you start a hole. You start running hot water into the hole, the hot water starts to melt out the water, the ice water. You suck that water up, and that becomes your drinking water. But why can't effectively melt water out of it anymore? And then you take that pipe, move it a quarter mile away, and take the poop pipe and put it in there. And you make giant poopsicles. So that's where the waste goes to at the South Pole. This is one of the food storage buildings. And that frost you see on the bars there is just from human breath. It's that cold. It's an average temperature of minus 60 down there. Okay. So, primes at telescopes. You want to pick on people, you take people that run the Ice Cube project, you tell them their thing's not a telescope, and they get all upset. So, this is one of the actual telescopes. And it's part of the Event Horizon Telescope Network. So you heard recently about how they imaged the black hole at the center of the galaxy? Well, the way they did that was to combine the input of telescopes as far from one another in pristine locations as they could get. And you can see how important the South Pole Telescope was to the Event Horizon Ice Cube. So neutrinos. I didn't know anything about neutrinos. I don't know much now, but I know that they are the most energetic, fastest, or most energetic and difficult to stop particle there is. And so people really didn't know much about neutrinos, how many there were, where they came from. They were more of a theoretical concept. So they dug this thing. Deep core, 6 strings optimized for low energies. Altogether, 86 strings, 60 sensors each, 5,160 optical sensors between 1,450 meters and why did they go that far down on the ice? Because every other particle is stopped by the ice, and the only thing that penetrates that deep is neutrinos. And because they have the strings, they could tell the direction of travel and the frequency of neutrino bombardment, and have gotten data that they never would have had in any other place. And you can tell scientists, because scientists are dedicated. I'm not sure I would get an I love neutrino tattoo about it. And it's just kind of neat. This is an impromptu lecture by one of the astronomers, and he's writing on the side of the telescope explaining to us how it works. Sometimes it's a little more formal. Once a week you get a talk. And this particular talk was really interesting because they had to figure out how to drag these big bladders of fuel all the way from McMurdo, 800 miles to the South Pole. And what could they use that had the least friction? And so he went through, how does this whole thing about friction on snow work? And basically it works because that little melted microlayer from the pressure makes the sled slip. And then they tried various materials and found out the best way to drag our fuel in. So, yes, there is life at the South Pole. Now, the day I got there, it was minus 56. The warmest it ever got was minus 20, and we had a picnic that day. But this is the South Pole Marathon. And yes, people did run at 10,000 feet at 25, failed their sanity test. And then you're sitting there minding your own business one day, and you look outside, and there's 2 trucks. And you're like, what the heck? And you go outside, and you look at the trucks, and they're in Japanese, and you start talking to the people, and they're driving across Antarctica for a documentary. And they just stopped at the South Pole Station to say hi. Another day, we were going outside, and a group of 8 women showed up. They were called the Ice Maidens. They were all British soldiers, and they were skiing across Antarctica unaided. It's an amazing place. And sometimes you get to do really unique things. So our station is located toward New Zealand. And so even though we're only a couple hundred yards from the pole, we operate on New Zealand time. The temporary tent shelters that are set up for the tourists are on the opposite side of the pole, and they're on the Chilean side. So we had New Year's at our base, slept it off, got up 12 hours later, and went and had New Year's again at the Chilean base. Not all bad. Okay, so you'd have to be really stupid to stick your tongue to the South Pole just to imitate that movie. But I think there's still a tongue print on the globe there. And they have little rituals. So there's a thing I couldn't participate in because it's called the 300 Club. You heat the sauna up to 200 degrees. You stay in there until you feel like you're going to die. And then you run outside. It used to be run outside naked, but now they let you wear shorts because it's a little gentler and kinder. And shorts and flip-flops. And you run around the pole, but it has to be at least minus 100. So it's a 300 degree Fahrenheit temperature difference. Neither one is pleasant. So I only got the 256. Okay, so how do we make this go? So things get funny at the South Pole because everything's relative. So this is the actual South Pole. And what am I doing? I'm running around the world. But my friend reminds me that I'm going forward in time. So now I'm going back in time. Ta-da! There it is. I ran around the world forward and I ran around the world backward. Oh, there we go. Okay, run. Please run. Go to the next one.
Yeah, or like the clicker. Go on.
So, anybody here who's a flat earther, I'm sorry, I got news for you. But what happens in the summer at the South Pole is just this. So this is probably October-ish, and the sun just goes round and round and round. And it does that, getting just a little higher every day until December 21st. And then it starts to drop down again. And it drops down until one day it hits the horizon. And once it hits the horizon, there's a period of about a week where you've got twilight. And then you've got 6 months of absolute darkness. Pretty much the only way you can explain that is if in fact the Earth is round. And the Earth being round has some advantages. So this is that period of twilight. So you'll see a little bit of lightning in the sky. But typical South Pole auroras. And this is Robert Schwartz, who is an amateur movie maker but does great movies, and also an astronomer. So you can see the sky getting light as astronomical twilight, and now it's getting dark again. And then the real auroras will hit here in a minute. And you can see all the meteors bouncing through.
Is the prevailing wind always coming from that direction?
It's variable at the pole, but generally yes. Probably 80% of the time. So, unlike the South Pole and McMurdo, there is Palmer Station. And you can only get to Palmer Station on a boat. You cannot fly there. And Uber won't come. So you're pretty much stuck using the boat. And the Drake Passage can get interesting. You see about half of people get sick, I think.
Oh, more than that.
Oh, yeah.
I think so.
But even as you're going along the Drake where you think it would be lifeless, you see whales, and that's a Commerson's dolphin. They're one of the most common dolphins down here. Just beautiful. And if you get lost, luckily the local citizens will tell you which way you ought to go. And finally, you get to the land of rainbows and unicorns, or Palmer Station. And there's the Gould coming in and anchoring up against the pier. And there's a ritual. The Gould comes in, the Gould stays for 4 or 5 days, the Gould leaves. And the more adventurous are gonna jump in off this pier about, was it about 10 feet in the water, 12 feet?
Something like that.
Yeah, or the less adventurous like me will jump in off the low pier. So you stand there and it's, 25 degrees outside and you're like, I'm a little chilly. And you only thought you were chilly previously. And you get out after 30 seconds in the water and your feet are numb. And the air feels warm. But of course then you run and jump in the hot tub. That's a whole other story. And whimsy is everywhere in Antarctica. So this is a building that was very small in the front, very large in the back, and somebody thought it looked like Doctor Who's TARDIS, so they decorated the whole building up as the TARDIS. We have a glacier to play on. So there's an area marked off where there are no crevasses, and we can climb up the glacier or walk around it. It's beautiful, but it's nice that it's marked. Okay. And you learn to hate the speed of sound. Because you're out there, the Mar-Piedmont Glacier is right there, and you hear crash, and you go, calving glacier, and you turn your head, and 4 seconds ago the glacier calved because it took that long for the sound to get to you. And so you see this, where it's already in the water. And then you get to play on the glacier. That's me coming up the glacier. Icebergs are ever present and are amazing. So this is a shot taken from the bar of an iceberg that just floated in to say hi. And sometimes they look like castles. And sometimes they're dragons. And sometimes they're just beautiful shapes. But the ice is just a constant source of amazement. All right, so I had to look for the longest time to find, firstly, the ice is also a place where animals take refuge. So you're constantly seeing seals and penguins out there on the ice. It's kind of like an aircraft carrier for penguins. So you see this ice all the time. It's called bar ice, and I suspect it's called bar ice because that's what we carry to the bar to break up in cubes and mix in our drinks. But I had to look forever to find out what it is. And it turns out it's ice that freezes on the bottom of an iceberg. And as it's freezing, of course, that's salt water. And what happens is, as the salt water freezes, the sodium chloride atoms don't fit well into the lattice structure of the ice. And the sodium chloride gets forced out, and it becomes little brine pockets. And those little brine pockets, plus the ice, create this golf ball pattern on the ice. Here we go.
So we'll delve for a little bit into the science that goes on at Palmer, and I'll interject for a minute to talk about the two projects that I've been a part of. So as I said, I study bacteria and then zooplankton, and then the step between that is phytoplankton. And so those groups are kind of the phytoplankton being the little plants in the water, and the zooplankton being the little animals that you see in the ocean. That might not be the most exciting things if you don't have a microscope, but when you're able to take a closer look, are pretty beautiful. And are very important for the system because, especially the krill, so these kind of shrimp-like zooplankton that we see, well, all over the world, but also at Palmer, basically everything eats them. So the penguins eat krill, the seals eat krill, the whales eat krill, and they're very dependent on sea ice. So they're very interesting and important to study in this area where we have a lot of warming and a lot less sea ice as the years go on. So I'll show you a little bit about what our field work looks like. This is the lab I've worked for the past 2 years, the zooplankton lab. And basically, when we go out in the field, we throw these big nets out behind the boat, and we go along a transect for a while, and the whole time the net is filtering through the water and collecting little animals in the end of the net. And we bring that guy back up and take it back to the lab and look at what we find. And it was a very exciting project to be a part of because until we got these boats a couple of years ago, and before then we weren't able to study zooplankton at Palmer Station over the course of the summer. So the past 2 years are the first time that we've been able to look at how that community is changing from October when we get there until March when we leave. And so the work is incredible. Being there is amazing. Once you get around the peak of summer in January, February, every day you go out, you see whales and penguins and seals, and it's an amazing place to be. And then I mentioned, we bring everything we catch out on the water back to the lab to process. These are krill, specifically Euphalgia superba, so they're the most common species that we see at Palmer. And so to process them, we'll lay them all out on a board like this, and we'll count how many we get, and we'll measure how long they are, the smaller ones, and then we'll take their biovolume, which basically just means kind of like seeing their mass, like their biomass in the water. And this is another, so usually to collect the krill, we'll take those big nets and haul them behind a boat. But last year there was a research cruise where they kind of took a different approach, so I'll show you that. They're scraping for krill under the ice edge.
This is incredibly dangerous. I mean, they're working right at the edge of breaking ice. And
so as I was mentioning, an important area to be studying these guys because the Western Antarctic Peninsula, where Palmer is one of the most rapidly warming regions on the planet. It's warming at about 4 times the rate of the rest of the world. And krill are extremely dependent upon sea ice for survival. So when they're young, they go under the ice to feed on the algae there and also for shelter from winds and things like that. So there's a concern that as the water gets warmer and the sea ice season gets less favorable for krill, and we might start to see more of these guys, which are salps, which are basically kind of big bags of water, not really nutritious, and not going to sustain the rest of the food web nearly as well as the krill do.
but basically compete with krill for food. Okay, so let's move on to green things on land. This will be a short topic. So this is carrying a garden of lichens. Now, if you like lichens, you'll like Palmer Station. There are just so many. Okay. Moss is pretty common. There are some deep moss beds. And we had moss researchers there studying it because they were able to go back in the moss and look at the deeper layers of moss and understand what things were like 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And there it is. You know your Sitka spruce here? That's the Sitka spruce of Antarctica. It is the biggest vascular plant in Antarctica. It's called hairgrass, and it's all about that big. But you'll walk by the stuff, and it'll be brown and dead. I'm ready to bloom. It's just incredibly responsive to weather. Okay. So you see a lot of things in Antarctica that are outsized or different from what you might see here. So we have amphipods pretty much everywhere, including here. And they're about that big. And there's an amphipod in Antarctica. And no, I'm not being brave, they don't bite. And how do we get the amphipods? With divers. The divers have some projects that are very, very important. And I'm privileged to be able to go out as a dive tender. So why do you need a dive tender? Well, because the equipment you're wearing weighs probably 70, 80 pounds, and you just can't get in and out of the boat without help. And also, you have to be on leopard seal alert, because there have been interactions between humans and leopard seals that were less than positive. So I'm constantly watching for leopard seals when I'm on dive tender duty and alert the divers so they can come up. Okay, bigger critters. These are ice fish. So there's 2 basic types of ice fish. There are the ones that don't have any hemoglobin, which is what this type is. So there's no red blood in these at all. And what's the disadvantage? They can't carry much oxygen in their blood at all. So they have to live right at the edge of freezing. If it gets at all warmer than 31, 32 degrees, they begin to struggle because they can't get enough oxygen to their tissues. They have multiple adaptations, huge hearts, huge vascular systems, but you just can't carry oxygen without hemoglobin. And when they're very small, they're as close to a dragon as you're ever gonna see. And there's the other kind of ice fish. Now, before you think I went fishing in Antarctica, which is an illegal activity under the treaty, occasionally the researchers need some samples of the ice fish. And the best way to get them is you dangle a piece of yarn. You don't need a hook. You just dangle the yarn in the water, and they'll grab a hold of that yarn, and they're never letting go. They don't see food come by very often. Okay. So these guys have red blood cells, but they've got a trade-off, because even though they can get more energy, their blood sludges easily, and they can clot easily and die. And so they have special antifreeze proteins in their blood that helps the blood not coagulate. All right, and then everybody likes penguins, unless of course you have to stand in a penguin colony and smell it. Then you still like them, but you know. So these are Adelie penguins, you can tell, because there's their babies, all furry and downy. Okay. And what does a penguin sound like? So we can't hear it, we don't have the sound. All right, so I'm talking to him, saying, hi, how are you, how are you? And the penguin goes, ah, ah. That's it. That's all you get.
It's a pretty good impression.
But they are cute. And I think he was more interested in me than I was in him, and I was plenty interested in him. Okay. And much like any teenager anywhere in the world, as the young ones get a little older, they get rebellious and get funny haircuts. But they outgrow it. Okay, so Adelies seem to be temperature sensitive, and as the area warms around Palmer, the number of Adelies has dropped off, and dropped off pretty dramatically. But what has happened is gentoo from further habitat in the area. And these are gentoo, and you can see the kind of white barrette going across the top of their head. Very typical looking gentoo. And there's a snowy sheathbill walking through the picture. So they look totally clumsy on land. And they often walk around and fall over. But in the water, they are amazing. They literally fly through the water. And I wish I had a video, because they're just coming up out of the water back. And our least common of the three common species is the Chinstrap penguin. And I just think they're the prettiest one of the group, but everybody's got their own opinion. And then there's this kind of penguin that only shows up on Christmas Day. So there's plenty of other birds, and Lee will be studying these. These are called blue-eyed shags. They're a cormorant. Okay. And you can probably see why they're called blue-eyed shags. This is my favorite bird, the giant petrel. And giant petrels are relatives of the albatross. They are huge, and they are tough, and they know it. And as a result, they're pretty gentle, because they're not afraid of you. You'll notice that they have a little tube on the top of their nose, and that's common to the petrels and to the albatrosses. This is an accessory smell function, and it allows them to detect things that are miles away and home in on their food source based on smell. And there's the chicks, and they're so cute. And they band the chicks in the nest, and when you go up and you're working to band, now I'm not nearly as close as I look right there, but still, you get fairly close to them, within 5 to 10 feet. This is a snowy sheathbill. It is the most maligned bird in Antarctica. Why? Because it's willing to associate with people. So it hangs out on the base, and everybody's like, sheathbills. Number one, it's the only non-web-footed bird in Antarctica. And two, they're good parents, and they take care of their children. So don't malign sheathbills. Okay. Strange question, Arctic tern or Antarctic tern?
I guess the Antarctic.
You're absolutely right. And the way you know that, though, because both Antarctic terns and Arctic terns spend the Antarctic summer in Antarctica, and then they fly all the way to the north and spend the northern hemisphere summer in the north. But the Antarctic terns breed in Antarctica and come north to feed and relax. And the Arctic terns do the opposite. They breed in the north and go south. So if you see a tern in Antarctica and it's in breeding colors, it's an Antarctic tern. But the longest flyers in the world. Now, talking about your maligned birds, these are skuas. And I think one of the former birders said it best. He said, a skua is a gull that thinks it's a raptor. So we don't have eagles or hawks in our area. Maybe hanging around, it's going to come eat it. So they are mean guys, and they're even mean to each other. They're constantly fighting. But they take care of their eggs too, and they have to feed their chicks. Now, it's interesting because the nests for a lot of these birds are very precarious. They're shallow. It's hard to make any kind of a good nest. So do you know something strange about the eggs? They're very pointed on one end. And that's because if you roll that egg, an egg would roll and fall out of the nest. So we talked about adaptation, about the krill cycle and how everything eats krill. Well, it turns out not everything eats krill. So this is a limpet, and there are a bazillion limpets in Antarctica. And there's something that eats limpets for a living, and that's kelp gulls. And if you go up on any, and there are, how many islands would you say we have? 100 anyway?
I have no idea.
High in the rocks, there are tens of thousands of limpet shells left there by the gulls that have brought them up there and eaten the limpets. So it's a whole nother little internal cycle within the Antarctic environment. All right, elephant seal. So cute, right? Well, as long as the wind's blowing the other way, absolutely. Oh, and another one we won't have the sound in. I'm going to have trouble making the sounds, I'll tell you that right now. Yeah, so this is a bunch of elephant seals, and basically they lay there all day and they go, bleh, bleh, bleh. That's about it. And there's my favorite, and most common, crab eater seals. And the crab eaters go from brown to this beautiful silver color, and it's just iridescent. It's amazing. And the crab eater is a misnomer. They're actually a krill-eating seal. And if you look at their teeth, the teeth have scalloped edges on them. So they'll take in a mouthful of water and krill, push the water out, and swallow the krill. There's our fur seal. And they go from a deep brown to this white color. Just beautiful, beautiful animals. But cantankerous? Woo! So I've been chased by fur seals any number of times. And there's the apex predator with the exception of the orca. Okay, so this is a leopard seal. And leopard seals eat penguins and they eat other seals. And okay. So one day, two of our researchers were out in a Zodiac getting it ready to launch from the dock, and a leopard seal swam up. And they are curious critters. And our two researchers are deciding, do I get out of the Zodiac and run up the ramp? Do I stay here? Boy, he sure seems interested.
They've been known to pop a Zodiac or two with their teeth too, if they decide to gnaw on the back. So.
And he's about ready to come in the boat. And they decide, that's enough of that. So then we get to the bigger guys. So humpbacks are our most common whale. And I think kind of December, January, we see humpbacks pretty much every day. Just beautiful, beautiful creatures. And the whale researchers identify the humpbacks based on their tail patterns. It's like a fingerprint. And they actually, the tail print is like Then they will get a little piece of skin and blubber using a crossbow. They study the genetics, they study the pregnancy hormones, so they're able to tell how often the females are coming into season, how often they're reproducing, because they know which female it is, and they know if they're pregnant or not. Okay, they know what family groups are where, and as they find these whales elsewhere in the world, they're able to figure out the migratory patterns for the whales. It's an amazing thing. And yes, they do come right up to station. These pictures, you almost never see the minke whales because they come up, go, and they're back down and they never pop back up in the same spot. So this is an amazing picture to actually see a minke spy hopping up like this. Okay, so this was taken in 2015. And if you look out on the ice right about just to the right of the center, you'll see a seal up there. And he's deciding he's not in the best place. Seals aren't all that common where we are, but we do see them a couple times in the winter. And these are guys who are doing what's called spy hopping. They're coming up and checking out where that seal is. Spoiler alert, the seal got away.
Good.
I think I got in the wrong neighborhood. And sunsets are just your typical kind of boring affair at Palmer Station. So we see probably 20 a year, and we host probably 15 or so. We'll either go out to the ship and give lectures, or the people from the ship, if it's an expedition ship, will come on to station and we'll act as tour guides and tell them about our station. And so one day I'm minding my own business and the bark Europa pulls in. And I start talking to people on the bark Europa, and I said, you know, I'm planning on trying to get to St. Helena, but they say the RMS St. Helena. And so I finished my season and hopped on the bark Europa and rode all the way across the Atlantic on it, but that's next time's talk. All right, questions about Antarctica?
So in the old days, the C-130 would leave Christchurch and it was 17 hours, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to Palmer. What's the C-17 do it in?
About 5.5. something like
Nice.
that. Yeah, it's a lot. A lot.
And how long a flight is it, the C-130 from Palmer to the South Pole?
It's like, I think 4.5 hours is what I'm remembering. They still take the twin otters back and forth occasionally.
Oh, they do.
That's a longer journey, and of course they don't have supplemental oxygen except masks, and so they stay low. But it's supposed to be a beautiful flight, and I'm sorry I never got to try it.
So how does a twin otter get from Christchurch to Palmer?
It flies to McMurdo and then flies from
Okay.
McMurdo. Yeah. And they had 2 winters ago, they had 2 patients at the South Pole in the middle of the winter and so they actually flew twin otters from Canada all the way down the spine of the Americas to Chile and across from Chile into the South Pole, out to McMurdo, out to Christchurch. And that was an amazing story. All right, how many of you have ever been to Antarctica? Okay, a fair smattering, pretty good. We didn't raise our hands.
That's true. I think it was implied.
Thank you for coming, and there's some stickers and patches on the table if anybody wants one.
Thank you.